back to On the Fly. It's here recapping, predicting the World Junior Championship, U18 Women's World, the Men's World Championship, Women's World Championship, U18 Men's World Championship. What is happening?
It is by far one of the dumbest things I have ever seen.
Prepare to die. Figured it was better safe than sorry.
Scores! Nathan McKinnon scores for Canada.
Your home for international hockey. This is On the Fly.
And hello everyone and welcome back to On the Fly, your home for international hockey. I am your host Parker McLean and you're listening to episode number 12 of the On the Fly International Hockey Podcast in partnership with the Cyclone Sports Podcast Network. Before we drop the puck, make sure to check out the StubHub and Viagogo affiliate links in the description. It's the best way to grab tickets and support what we do here on the show. While you're there, consider joining our membership on YouTube. Jump into the Division 1A tier to unlock loyalty badges, custom emojis, priority replies, and exclusive polls, or go pro with the top division tier to get member shoutouts, access to our private chat rooms, and the power to request specific podcast topics, plus all the perks from the levels below. Today we'll be continuing our off-season recaps in the IIHF, talking about Iceland, China, Ukraine, and Latvia's international campaigns. We'll discuss the recently wrapped up Challenger Series, as well as take a look forward to the return of international hockey this weekend with the World Junior Summer Showcase, before we, as always, answer your live questions towards the end of the program. If you are hanging out with us live on YouTube, thank you for being here on this beautiful Wednesday evening, depending on where you're watching from. Be sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe to join our international hockey community. If you're catching us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow and a 5-star rating, which helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. You can also find us on Instagram, X, and TikTok at OnTheFly1515 for daily lower division recaps and real-time updates on the world of international hockey. But with that, we will hop on into it today, and we will start here with Team Iceland's international season recap. And we think about Iceland, kind of what they've done so far. It hasn't exactly been the best of seasons for Team Iceland. Coming in, they did have some hopes that they might be able to earn a promotion or two, but really for Iceland this year, it was a matter of protection. They were trying to defend themselves as best they could from the threat of relegation. And we kicked it off at the Men's World Junior Division 2B tournament, which was held in Belgrade, Serbia from January the 18th to the 24th, where we saw Israel take down Iceland on the opening day 5-4. New Zealand then beat them 6-2. The Netherlands came out on top 5-0. Iceland did end up pulling out a win against Serbia, the host, winning 4-2, although they did end up losing shortly thereafter to Australia, a 6-5 final in that one. And with that result, ended up placing them last in their group, which means they will be relegated down to the lower division for the 3A level for next year. And so it wasn't exactly the best of starts for Team Iceland this international campaign, although once again, as we had mentioned, this season in particular was more of a defensive campaign for them. They did have some hopes as we kind of continued on throughout the international season that they may be able to pull off that upset, but at the same time, an early start here that kind of went a little bit in a disappointing fashion. You think about that opening game against Israel, a team that frankly should be outplaying Iceland, and they did. They ended up pulling out the win, 5-4 final there, and probably was the most competitive game of this tournament for Iceland, even in the game that they ended up winning. I would say this game against New Zealand was that one game that they really needed, the one that they really wanted to win if they were going to eventually avoid that relegation spot. Unfortunately for Iceland, they end up losing it, and with that, end up in that relegation spot. Their game against the Netherlands, a blowout type of game, not overly close in the slightest. And then you go into that game against Serbia where it starts to become a little bit of that desperation factor. And we really saw that kind of kick in for this Icelandic team. And you go into a tough game against Serbia. Serbia also on home ice. We did see a really well-played game from Iceland in this one. They were able to control what they could, and although they were outplayed, the pace of play much better for the Serbs in this game, they struggled to get much going on the offensive side of the puck, and that was really the difference maker in this one. We ended up seeing, of course, Iceland pull out the victory, and it set up an important final day, a chance to avoid the relegation spot. And unfortunately for Iceland, they fall out just a goal short against Team Australia. And although Australia did control most of this game, we did see Iceland get their chances. And when they got them, they did a very good job of capitalizing on the opportunity. And that really wrapped it up for Iceland in their opening tournament of this international campaign. A very disappointing start for them for this international season, but they did bounce back in a big way as they shifted along to the Women's Under-18 tournament, which was the Division 2B Women's Under-18, which was held in Cape Town, South Africa from January the 26th to February the 1st. And this tournament as well, I would say, was one that they had hopes for of a promotion. It wasn't necessarily their highest hopes of a promotion at this tournament. That belongs to the next two tournaments as far as their really kind of goal and their expectation of earning that promotion. But this tournament, the Women's Under-18 Division 2B tournament in Cape Town, South Africa, was one that they also were looking at, and it kicked off on a very good note. A 21-0 victory over South Africa, followed up by a 4-3 loss in the shootout against Belgium in a game that they should have probably won. Romania ends up beating them 5-1 in that next game. Romania, a very strong team at that tournament. Iceland then goes on to beat Mexico 5-1 before beating Chinese Taipei 5-4 in overtime to close out the tournament. And you kind of think about this tournament for Iceland, and they start in a pretty good fashion. They go out and beat the host South Africa by a score of 21-0. They outshoot them 86-5, which when you outshoot a team 86-5, you're normally going to win that game. And it was definitely a good step in the right direction, and one that they really needed to get their tournament on the right note. A disappointing next game against Belgium where they had a lot of chances. They generated a lot of chances. Unfortunately for Iceland in this one, they just didn't really get that goal, that kind of separating goal to put them over the edge. Belgium finds their way into the overtime frame. They find themselves into the shootout frame. And of course, when you get to a shootout, it really is anybody's game, and Belgium ends up taking care of business. They end up taking that one, which was also a pretty big win for them in the grand scheme of things. And then you go on to the game against Romania, and when you play a team like Romania, it's always a tough kind of game at these kind of tournaments, and especially the women's under-18 level for this Romanian team this year. Just kind of a game that Iceland couldn't really find their groove, and Romania took it to Iceland from basically start to finish, and in the end, we did see Romania end up taking this one 5-1 the final. Their game against Mexico was a really good bounce back, and one that I think you wanted to see if you were this Icelandic team. A really well-played game there, and they end up taking that with a big win, setting up that final game of final day of the games, which was against Chinese Taipei. Chinese Taipei did play a very competitive game against Iceland, but in the end, the Icelandic team just kind of found their chances and buried them. It was really the storyline of this tournament for Iceland, is when they got their opportunities, they didn't miss it. And it's an important thing for a team like an Iceland where they are going to go into some of these tournaments, not necessarily favored. And we talked about it off the start, how this team was really trying to protect their standing at a lot of these tournaments, and they didn't necessarily get that success at the start and at the end. But in their middle tournaments, they did do a pretty good job of, when they got that opportunity, they buried it. They didn't necessarily let kind of those weaker teams come back in. The women's under 18, no exception to that. They did finish second at this tournament, picking up the silver medal, and we will see what they can do into next year's Division 2B women's under 18 tournament, where they will look to try and earn the promotion spot as they are starting to get to that cusp of that area, and we'll see what that under 18 program will look like heading into next year. Then we go on to the Division 3B men's under 18 tournament, and this is one that I would say you looked at it for Iceland, and this was probably maybe the men's worlds, which we'll talk about next, that tournament that they had their highest hopes on as far as that promotion spot might go. They started with they start really hot. A 12-1 win over Luxembourg, followed up with a 5-1 win over Turkmenistan, and then they run into Thailand. And this Thai team was a problem for them all tournament long. We then see Thailand take that game 4-2 the final. Iceland then makes the playoff rounds. Reminder, this was that new format the IIHF was testing out at the men's under 18 Division 3B tournament, which then saw them into the semifinal playoff round against Bosnia. Iceland had no problem taking on Bosnia, winning 8-2 the final in that one before they had their rematch against Thailand in the finals. Unfortunately for Iceland, they did fall just short, losing 4-3 in overtime. But for this tournament, there was a lot of positives to take away if you are Iceland. You start the tournament really well, a big win over Luxembourg on that opening day. You follow it up with a big win over Turkmenistan as well. And then their game against Thailand, really both of them, and although you end up losing both of them, there was a lot of really good hockey played from Iceland, and you play that game 10 times over, you probably win between 6 or 7 of them, right? And that's what you need if you are Iceland, is you need to be able to play the right way. And even if you don't get the results, you need to try and control the pace of play, generate offense when it comes. And when you get that opportunity, you need to bury it. And sometimes you get those looks, sometimes you don't. But in this tournament in particular, when they got their opportunities, they tended to bury on them. Unfortunately, just couldn't quite get that one extra goal to put themselves into that champion spot, and as well the promotion bid up to that Division 3A level. But a reminder that the men's under 18 promotions were all annulled, with Belarus coming in to that top spot, and so we will see next year what ends up happening for this Icelandic team, as they will likely once again take on Thailand in what will be a very fascinating matchup, and one that I'd say, obviously the under 18 program, we tend to see a little bit of kind of transfer between up and down with age outs as well, but this is a really good spot for Iceland in a tournament they will be very happy with walking away from. They finish with the silver medal at the men's under 18 Division 3B World Championships, and then they go into their next one, which was the Division 2B Men's World Championship, the senior level, which happened from April the 6th to the 12th in Sofia, Bulgaria. They started this tournament with a 6-5 win over Chinese Taipei, followed up with a 6-2 win over Team New Zealand, a 6-3 win over Kyrgyzstan, before a 3-1 loss against Bulgaria, followed up by one of the most disappointing losses of the entire tournament, what ended up shaping out to be the gold medal game, Israel taking down Iceland 5-2 the final in that one. And you think about this tournament for Team Iceland, this was the one they had circled on their calendar, walking in as favorites, and definitely a team that wanted to be in that gold medal promotion range. They unfortunately just fall out a little bit short on it, coming in third place, but really if they end up winning that game against Israel with their spots already, they would have very likely ended up in that gold medal spot. And so for Iceland, it was a disappointing end. And you think about how this tournament played out. You start with a bit of a scare against Chinese Taipei, but you end up pulling through with the victory in that one. The game against New Zealand, a game that they absolutely earned the win in. It was a tight checking one, but once again, when they got the opportunities, they capitalized on it in this game. Same thing in their game against Kyrgyzstan. Although they did not necessarily control the pace of play in this game, when they got their chances, they capitalized on them, and that was what we were expecting really from Iceland all tournament long. Then you went into that game against Bulgaria, and the game against Bulgaria was one that they're going to want back at the end of this tournament, because as much as, yes, it doesn't really impact anything in the grand scheme of things, you end up losing to Israel anyway. You get that win, it's a really good momentum setter going into that also important game. Unfortunately for them, they don't get that win. They kind of go into a bit of a funk, and then they go and play Israel for the championship game, and they fall short. And that game against Israel, they played okay. I'm not going to say they played terribly, but you end up losing that game. You end up basically losing the tournament, and from there, it just wasn't exactly the best of tournaments as they look back on it, because that was their tournament, right? That was the tournament they had their eyes set on for the promotion bid. They fall just short. Team Iceland does end up earning the bronze medal at that Division 2B Men's World Championship, which shifts us on to our final tournament, and that is the Women's World Championship Division 2A tournament. And for this tournament, for those who aren't aware, maybe have not been following our coverage of it, a reminder that North Korea did end up opting out of this tournament. And so when they played it, they weren't sure whether or not the last place team was going to end up being relegated from this tournament. And it was a question mark at that time. They weren't sure what was going to end up being the case. And now in hindsight, as we take a look back on this tournament, we end up finding out that North Korea was protected when they opted out, which means that the last place team, the 5th place overall team at this tournament, ends up getting sent down to the Division 2B level. So with that in mind, we'll start here with this tournament. Iceland did pick up a big win on the opening day over Slovenia, the host, 4-3 the final, for losing to Poland 4-1, Australia 4-1, and they end up losing to Chinese Taipei 4-3 in a shootout. And with that, it ends up placing them in that 5th spot, the relegation spot. And so because North Korea did not participate at this year's Women's World Championship tournament, Iceland will be the team who ends up being relegated down to the Division 2B level, which, you think about it, is a very disappointing result for them, and one that they're going to look back on at the end of this tournament and kind of wonder how it came to be. And they started this tournament with a very well-played game against Slovenia, a game that they wanted to win. They showed that they deserved to win. Unfortunately for them, just didn't really get the right combo results after that. Their game against Poland, a disappointing loss, a blowout game. They didn't have high hopes heading into that game against the Poles, but still, they end up losing that one. Same kind of thing with Australia, just playing against a better team. Not too many surprises there. And then their game against Chinese Taipei, where you think about that one, this game was pretty much all Iceland, the entirety of it. Unfortunately for Iceland, they didn't necessarily capitalize on those opportunities when they got them. Chinese Taipei did. We end up seeing that final result, a 4-3 win in the shootout, which ends up sending Iceland down to the Division 2B level for next year. A very disappointing ending to their international season for Team Iceland. And as we kind of think back on the overall sort of grading for this tournament, or this international campaign for Team Iceland, we are going to give them a D+. And you look at their season, this season was always going to be trying to protect themselves from being sent down. A disappointing result at the Women's World Championship definitely hurts them in a pretty severe way. The Women's Worlds, they were expected to be somewhat close in. They fall fairly short as well in the end. The Division 2B World Juniors, they end up getting relegated from that tournament as well. So basically 2 relegation performances as well, 2 silver medals and a bronze in those tournaments that they had some expectation for. And so it was definitely an underwhelming year for Team Iceland. And although they definitely had some bright moments, you think about those 3 middle tournaments, the start and the end are what bring that grade so far down. And when you get relegated twice, it's never a good sign for them. And we'll see kind of as they look ahead now what it's going to end up being for them if they are going to be able to kind of find their way back in. It will be definitely interesting to watch. But for Iceland this year, a D+ rating will be their final international season recap grade. It has not been the most great tournaments for Team Iceland, but definitely some positives to take into next year. As we will now shift into our second topic of discussion today, and that will be Team China's international hockey season recap. We look at Team China overall this year. It's been a bit of a hot-cold type of deal for them. We've seen 2 silver medals, a gold medal, earning the promotion spot as well as a Women's World Championship relegation and a 5th place finish. So a very hot-cold spectrum for Team China this year, and it all started for them at the Division 2A World Junior Championships, which were held in Bucharest, Romania from January the 4th to January the 10th. They started this tournament with a 4-3 loss in the shootout against Team Romania. They then followed up with a win over Spain, 5-2 the final there, a 4-1 loss against South Korea, a 4-3 loss against Croatia, and then a 4-3 loss in overtime against Team Great Britain. And you look at this tournament for Team China, a tournament that I would say coming in, they had some expectations for it. They weren't necessarily the favorites walking into it. Definitely a kind of middle-of-the-road team. And what we ended up seeing from this Chinese squad is a little bit of lackluster performance. And don't get me wrong, they had some really good performances throughout the rest of this international season. But this opening tournament for them was definitely one that they would definitely want back at the end of it. And for this Division 2A World Junior Tournament, you kind of think about their start, right? And it always tends to kind of come down to their start in a game that they were outplayed in against Romania. They end up taking it to a shootout. They lose in that shootout, but Romania earned or should have earned their win a lot sooner in that game, but China held around, and then eventually forced the extra points out of Romania and ended up picking up a big point in the process. Then you go on to that second game, in a game that they absolutely outplayed Spain in, a very well-deserved win on that account. Their game against Korea was a difficult game for them. They really struggled to get much going in it, but in the end, Korea was the better team, and they definitely earned that 4-1 win. Then you go to that next game, and this was the game that I think I look back on and say, this is that game that if you're China, you want to have back. And that was that game against Croatia, the 4-3 loss against Croatia, because this was a game that you outplayed your opponent in, and unfortunately, you just didn't necessarily get those results that you had anticipated for. And so that is the kind of game that if you're China, you want to have back. And outside of that, I mean, their game against the Brits, they were outplayed. They held around, very similar to that game against Romania. Same scoreline. Both games went to overtime. This Romanian game ended up going to a shootout. But really, you think about it, it was just kind of clawing points where they could get it. They earned a point against Romania, a point against Great Britain, and then they got the 3 points against Spain. And you think about the way that this tournament could have gone, right? You end up taking that win against Croatia. You end up earning a few points here or there against Romania or Great Britain, and all of a sudden you are into the medals, and this is a completely different conversation for their opening tournament. But you kicked it off, a 5th place finish at the Division 2A World Juniors, which then ended up setting up one of their better tournaments, and one that we saw them really take it to that next level, and that was the Division 1B Women's Under-18 World Championships, which was held in Katowice, Poland. And they started this tournament with a 4-3 win in the shootout over the hosts in Poland. They followed that up with a 4-2 win over Austria, a 4-1 win over Great Britain, a 10-0 win over Australia, and then an 8-0 win over Team Spain. And you look at it, right, this was the kind of performance for them that they were anticipating, especially at that Women's Under-18 tournament. Outside of their game against Poland, really, I would say is really that only game that you weren't 100% confident in China to end up pulling out that result. The game against Austria as well was a bit of a closer game, but still, you just kind of saw with even the play style of that tournament, you figured that the Chinese team would end up coming out on top. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Women's World Championship tournament coming up, but the fact we're seeing a promotion bid for this Chinese team after a relegation at the Women's Worlds Division 1A level, it does bode very well for them and a sign of a good things to come, and something that I'm actually really excited for, to see how China can continue to progress on this international stage. Because you think about the Women's Worlds, whenever you go down, you tend to look at your younger divisions, and we're seeing a rise in Chinese young women's hockey, and so we'll see kind of what that next impact is. But Division 1B women's under 18s, we did see China take the gold medal and the promotion bid, which was a big deal for them, and we'll see what they can end up doing heading into next year's Division 1A women's under 18 campaign, where who knows, maybe they might be able to earn a top division bid. Will definitely be fun to monitor on that account, especially when you think about the Finns coming down from that tournament, or the top division tournament this year. It will be definitely something to monitor heading into next year's tournament. But then we go on to the Division 2A men's under 18 campaign, and this was another one that I would say they look back on and they played fairly well throughout this tournament. Outside of their first game against Japan, they were a dominant team, and they start the tournament with a 3-1 loss against Team Japan, followed it up with a 1-0 win over Great Britain, a 3-0 win over Croatia, a 4-2 win over Team Romania, and a 2-0 win over Team Spain. And so you look at this tournament for Team China, and outside of that opening game against Japan, and this is probably one of the most dominant tournaments we've seen from Japan in years past, this one in particular, we were expecting the Chinese to be a kind of that second place team, I would say. You could see a team like Romania, especially on home ice, being in that conversation, but they were pretty clear-cut. Great Britain as well, I'll throw in there. They were pretty clear-cut inside that top three of teams that we were expecting to kind of lead the charge at this turn, especially at the men's under 18 level, and they delivered on that expectation. Outside of that opening game, as we talked about, they were outplayed by Japan, a very strong Japanese team this year at the under 18s. Followed it up with a strong performance over Great Britain, a strong performance over Croatia, a very competitive game against Romania they ended up pulling through with, and really the same thing in their game against Spain. But it's the fact that they're comfortable in playing in those tight checking types of games that really gave them that advantage in the end. And although it is only a silver medal, it's still something to be very proud of, because once again, they're still looking to try and earn their way up. Yes, you always want those promotion bids, but the fact you come second bodes well for next year. And you think about them playing at this 2A tournament as well. The men's under 18s, you're going to get to go see Japan again, because once again, any men's under 18 campaign tournaments those promotions were annulled. And so we'll see what ends up happening next year for Team China. They did show very well at this tournament, and we'll see what that next crop of players at the under 18 level will end up being. But it should be interesting to see there as we shift on to our fourth tournament, which was the Women's World Championship Division 1A level. In this tournament, coming in, it was an expectation that China was going to be relegated. There wasn't much of a debate there, and especially when you look at the talent around them between Slovakia, between Hungary, Italy, France, and Norway. All five of those teams were hands down better than they were. And we walked into that tournament wondering, well, could they potentially pull off one big upset at this tournament and find their way into this tournament for yet another year? Ultimately, not the case. They start this tournament with a 7-0 loss against Team Slovakia, a 4-0 loss against Hungary, a 4-0 loss against Norway, an 8-1 loss against Team France, and they concluded their tournament with a 7-0 loss against Team Italy. And really, all of these games were not close. And yes, the score lines, you can look at them, dominant performances, but even when you look kind of a step further at the actual games, there was very little life for this Chinese team in any of their games. Struggled to get much to the middle of the ice. Their quality of chances were very poor, and they just didn't really get too much going. And that was the issue all tournament, right? And you go into a tournament that you're expected to be relegated, you're expected to lose, and kind of lose in a bad way as well. it's never an easy step. And I think they did do a decent job at kind of keeping games closer than what they probably should have been. They only scored 1 goal at this entire tournament in their game against the French. And once again, it wasn't their best tournament, right? And there's no sugarcoating that. Every team has their great tournaments. Every team has their not so great tournaments. And this tournament for China was kind of that stinker, and one that was expected from the start. No miracle run for the Chinese team this year at the Women's Worlds Division 1A level. We'll see what they can do at the 1B level into next year, because once again, it is going to be a little bit of a competitive realm, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tournament in just a few minutes. So we'll move on to the last tournament that we saw for China this international season. That was from April 29th to May the 5th, hosted on home ice in Shenzhen, China. They did finish second here at the Division 1B Men's World Championship Tournament. They started this tournament with a 7-4 loss against Team South Korea. They followed up with a 4-3 win in overtime against Romania, a 6-3 win over the Netherlands, a 3-0 win over Team Spain, and then a 4-3 win in the shootout over Team Estonia. And you look at this tournament really for this Chinese team, and it was one that you start with a relatively disappointing loss against South Korea, a game that you would have liked to have had. And we talked a little bit at the start about where your expectations lie. For China, the expectation at this tournament lied within them being between that kind of third, fourth, maybe even second spot, depending on where you place them. I'd say South Korea for sure, Estonia, the two teams that I would say were, not to say miles ahead, but kind of in that next bracket up on them. They lose to South Korea on that opening game. It wasn't necessarily their best. Romania as well is another team you might throw in there, kind of in that better than them range, but you keep it going, right? They pull off a nice win over Romania in a game that they just kind of hung around. And the Romanians outplayed China in this game, but China did a good enough job at just kind of holding on for dear life. And in the end, that was their trick, and that was their key to success at the end of this one. Follow that one up, 6-3 win over the Netherlands, a really well-played game here, earning some more of those points and in a really important 3 points in that tournament at that point, at least at that point in the tournament. Another 3 points with the 3-goal win over Team Spain. That was another big one for them, just to kind of secure themselves out of that relegation side. It wasn't really in doubt that it wasn't really kind of a question that they would end up in that spot, but still, it was good to see them kind of find their way out. And then probably their most impressive win of this entire tournament was that final day against Estonia, where we see them pull off that big win. Yes, another game that they probably should have lost in, but it's the story of just keeping with it, right? And not allowing teams that are better than you to get much going. And if you can continue to do that, we're going to talk about Latvia a little bit later, who is probably the best at doing that. You do set yourself up for a lot of success. And so for Team China this year, we are going to give them a B. And you think about their tournament results, right? They had a relegation, and what was an expected relegation, so not necessarily the most impactful. They earned their promotion at the women's under-18s, which was a very well-earned win for them there. Fifth place finish at the World Juniors, which for me was not necessarily their best potential finish, and so that was a little bit, is what drags their mark down a little bit. And then 2 second-place finishes at the men's under-18s and senior men's world championship tournaments. And so that would be where I would say that B side comes in. You kind of have a lot of cancellations between the promotion and the relegation, the second places and the fifth place. We'll see what ends up happening for China next year, but there was a lot to have your head high on if you are this Chinese team heading into next year. We'll see what ends up shaping out to be, especially on their women's side, where we saw the relegation at the Women's Worlds as well as the promotion at the Women's Under-18s. Tends to be a sign of good things to come heading into next year. We'll see what that Chinese team is going to look like on the women's side, as well on that men's side, as they try and earn their promotion bids after 2 very close calls this year. We'll see what ends up shaping out to be for the next one. As we will now move on to topic number 3 today, and that will be the Men's Challenger Series. And for those who may not know, the Men's Challenger Series was a way for kind of smaller hockey countries that aren't necessarily known even in the IIHF that now have their chance to play in this tournament. It was a 2-leg tournament. The men's one, and we'll talk about the women's one in a second as well, but the Men's Challenger Series tournament had 2 legs. It was the first leg was in Chicago, Illinois, USA from May the 7th to the 10th, with the second leg happening from July the 9th to July the 12th in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And so we'll start this one with the opening set of games. And so the teams participating were Greece, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Lebanon in a 4-team tournament. We started this one on May the 7th, and this was the opening game of this tournament, a single game day, where we saw Jamaica take down Greece in what was kind of that kickstart of this tournament. And you think about this game, the way that it ended up playing out, Jamaica had their chances and they buried them, right? And this was a fairly offensive tournament to begin with, and you'll see the score lines throughout be on the higher side of things, the defensive play, not necessarily as honed in as we might see at World Championship types of tournaments, but a really good start here for the Jamaican team where they were not, I don't want to say they were outplayed, but the Greece had the better looks throughout the entire game. They got some good saves when they needed it. And in the end, you look at the way Jamaica played, they found their chances, and when they got those chances, they found the back of the net in them. And so for Jamaica in this one, a really good start to this tournament for them that they end up kind of finding their way through. And we tend to see a little bit of that kind of question marks off the start of the tournament of what are these two teams going to bring, and we see a little bit of the rust factor as well kick in, and especially for a team like Greece, and you'll see as this tournament does progress, the Greeks just get better and better. The rust factor is absolutely something to consider because it does play a huge part, especially early on in tournaments, whether it's the high-level World Championship competitions or it's the Challenger Series. We do see a little bit of that progression as tournaments go along, that teams do definitely get better and better who might not have played with each other in the past. Then we go on to that second day of games on May the 8th, where we saw Greece take down Lebanon 10-6, the final there, and then Puerto Rico with a 6-2 win over Team Jamaica. That second, kind of the games we look at here, a game for Greece and Lebanon. The Greeks played another good game at this one. They do find their chances a lot more in that game. They had definitely some better looks than kind of their first one against Jamaica, but still 2 very solid games to kick off this tournament for Team Greece. For Lebanon in this game, they also were a fairly competitive team throughout, but we did just see that little bit of refinement, that fine-tuning in the game that separates teams like Greece and Lebanon in this type of competition. And then their second game of the day was between Puerto Rico and Jamaica. Puerto Rico ends up taking it 6-2 the final, a very well-played game from Puerto Rico here. Didn't give Jamaica a whole lot, and when they kind of did generate chances, Puerto Rico did a very good job at kind of neutralizing any of those opportunities, and some good goaltending in net always helps and goes a long way, but Puerto Rico was kind of that clear-cut better team off this opening game. In kind of as this tournament progressed, as we move on to that third day on May the 9th, we see Greece continue to find their game. And Greece, once again, got better and better as this tournament went along. An 8-5 win over Puerto Rico on the 9th as well. Jamaica took down Lebanon 6-2 the final there. But you think about that game for Greece, and it was, yes, it's an 8-5 game. It's a high-scoring game. But it's also kind of the quality of game, the quality of chances that really separates a team like Greece at this tournament. And we ended up seeing both on the men's and women's side, kind of the Greeks being that extra separator. They played extremely well in this game and one that they absolutely deserved the win in. The Jamaica-Lebanon game was a tighter checking game, a very close one. We saw a lot more of that kind of defensive style, and yes, I can appreciate it is a 6-2 game, but a lot of perimeter shots, a lot of chances that didn't necessarily get the kind of that high quality, high danger type of area. And so for Jamaica, they end up getting those best chances. They end up finding the back of the net in it. But still, really good to see for Team Jamaica to kind of find themselves back on that winning column after a tough game against Puerto Rico. Then you went on to the May the 10th games. Puerto Rico does win 5-4 in overtime, which ended up concluding the Chicago leg of this series. A reminder that it was the two legs, the first leg in Chicago, second leg in Montreal. But for this Puerto Rican team, able to pull out a win against a very competitive Lebanon team, where you think about Lebanon all tournament long, really, they were just a thorn in their competitors' side, and they earned their points by playing difficult. And that's what you wanted to see from them if they were going to be a competitive team at this tournament, was the fact that they were going to get into those dirty areas. They were going to be annoying to play against. They were going to be a team that when you made a mistake, you were going to see them come back the other way and likely score. And for Lebanon, they made their fair share of mistakes. We saw it especially in this game. But still, for Puerto Rico, the better team, and they end up earning that win in overtime fashion there. Then we moved on to Canada, and we moved to Montreal. We skipped forward a month, or 2 months, I guess, with both June and now July kicking in, and this is where we pick up a lot more recently, which was July the 9th. And we kicked off, or restarted this tournament with Greece beating Jamaica by a score of 7-5. A reminder that Jamaica did beat Greece in their opening game of the series on that first leg, 7-5. Jamaica won over Greece 7-5. And so Greece does get a little bit of that retribution on July the 9th in the opening game of the second leg. A very well-played game from Greece, and we saw a little bit of that rust kind of go away in this game. And yes, there were a few mistakes made by Greece throughout, and Jamaica took full advantage of that, but in the end, we saw Greece pull through with the victory here, kind of that better team throughout this entire game. Then the second game, where once again, Lebanon and Puerto Rico, the game we saw kind of close out the first leg. We see this in a rematch. This time, Lebanon comes out on top 5-4 in overtime over Puerto Rico. This was another game that I would say was one of those back and forth types of marathons. And a game that, once again, you're looking at a team like Lebanon, they wanted to be annoying. They wanted to be pesky, and they controlled the pace throughout this entire game. Generated a lot of shots, generated a lot of opportunities, and especially when you're playing in this type of series, the more chances you can get, the better, because you don't know what's going to end up being stopped. You don't know what's going to be saved. And so the more chances you can generate, the better off you're going to be. And Lebanon in this game took full advantage of that. They end up taking this game 5-4 in overtime after what was a pretty dominant game. After, I would say, a much more competitive first leg matchup, we saw the second leg be much more in favor of Team Lebanon as they tried to earn their spot in that final round. They did need a little bit of help on their way. It didn't help that they end up losing 10-8 to Greece in a game that was another kind of closer type game. Lebanon being that pesky type of team. Greece, though, took care of business, took that game by his final score of 10-8, and then a 7-4 win by Jamaica over Puerto Rico in a very dominant game that Puerto Rico, once again, stuck around long enough to make it a competitive matchup, but still, we end up seeing Jamaica pull through with the victory, a 7-4 final at that. Then we go on to July the 11th, and the final day of round robin action, where we saw Greece take down Puerto Rico 5-1, and Lebanon go out and beat Jamaica by a score of 6-3. And you think about these games, the first one, Greece and Puerto Rico, was a complete domination by Greece. It wasn't necessarily the closest of games we've seen, and even on the score line, right, a 5-1 final. We've seen closer games throughout this tournament. We've seen a lot bigger blowouts as well. But really, for this Greek team, they knew what they had to do. They knew what was at stake, and they took care of business on that final day. And then the interesting one, and for Lebanon, a game against Jamaica where Jamaica really outplays Lebanon throughout, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't matter how you play. It matters how many goals, how many pucks end up in the back of the net. And Lebanon did a tremendous job in this game of when they got their opportunities, they capitalized on them. There wasn't a lot of, well, this could go in, this might not go in. When they got their chance, they really did do a good job at finding the back of the net. Where for Jamaica, yes, they had a lot of opportunities, just didn't really have that quality that we saw from them really all tournament long. Probably didn't help that it was a relatively meaningless game going into the finals as they were already clinched in. But you look at it for the Jamaican team, they end up with where they need to be. They play Greece in the finals, your final standings for that round robin. Greece was in that top spot with 15 points. Jamaica was in the second spot with 9. Puerto Rico in third with 6. And Lebanon also with 6. Loses on tiebreaker, ends up in that fourth spot. And so you look at it for this tournament, right? The final day comes around. The final game, Greece taking on Jamaica for the gold, for the championship, for the Challenger Series title. And we see Greece pull through with the victory, a 10-6 final here. And it was a pretty good tournament, right? And for Greece, yes, they started a little slow, losing to Jamaica in that opening game, but they rally their way back. And that's really the story of these tournaments, is you wanted to see how these teams would respond when they were put up against some of the tougher competition inside that, kind of in those games that you don't necessarily know which way it's going to go. And Greece did a very good job of when they got challenged, when they got threatened, they didn't back down from the challenge. And this game was no different than that, right? You think about kind of the way this game plays out. Yes, Greece was the better team, but Jamaica also had plenty of chances that if Greece wasn't up to their game, Jamaica could have very well ran away with it. And so the end of this tournament, we do see Greece on the top. We see them take home the winner, the champions, if you will. As far as some of those kind of top players for each of the respective teams, Panayotis Efremidis from Greece was hands down probably the best player of this tournament. 7 games played, 11 goals, 4 assists for 15 points, and really controlled a lot of the offense for this Greek team. And especially in a tournament that was so offensive, you were looking for those key offensive players to really step it up. Malik McGowan is another one who really took it to that next level. He was on Team Jamaica, and it was a really big part to that Jamaican team. Although we did only play in 4 games, we did see him generate 6 goals, 2 assists for 8 points. And you think about what it could be for a Jamaican team that is trying to make their bid into the IIHF for the official World Championship titles. Those are the kind of players you'll look to see whether or not they can eventually make their way up. Chase Freiermuth from Puerto Rico was another one, had a really good tournament, 6 games, played 7 goals, 5 assists for 12 points. And then Danny Akuche for Lebanon, another forward here, 6 games played, 5 goals, 9 assists for 14 points. And so you look at it across the board, you think about kind of those key players, your MVPs of the tournament. Those would be my 4 kind of players that really stood out to me throughout this tournament. There were a lot of really good things that came out, a lot of attention, a lot of media as well. And so I'm excited to see kind of what the future holds for all 4 of these teams, for Greece, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Lebanon. As really all 4 of those teams, Greece we've seen up at the top division, or not the top division, but we've seen them at the IIHF World Championship competitions. I do think we're going to start to see more countries, especially over the next few years, come in, and this tournament in particular is a really good way to start to showcase what it could be moving forward. But the Men's Challenger Series, which happened from May the 7th to 10th and July 9th to 12th, was a resounding success on the men's side, and we'll talk a little bit more about the women's side in just a minute here, but very well played tournament from all these teams. Greece is your winner on the men's side for this Challenger Series, and we'll see kind of what's to come for them as they continue their hockey journey throughout as a country, and we'll see what it could develop into. as we will now shift on to our fourth topic of discussion today, and that will be the Women's Challenger Series. And we just wrapped up talking about the Men's Challenger Series. Now we'll discuss a little bit more about the Women's Challenger Series. And same thing as the men's. It was May the 7th to the 9th, which was held in Chicago, Illinois, USA, and in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, from July 9th to 12th. And so this tournament was another one that was all about developing nations coming up, trying to showcase their talent and see what they can put together on the global stage. The teams representing at this tournament, we saw Greece, we saw Lebanon, we saw a team out of Chicago, we saw the APNA team, which was a team representing kind of an Indian descent type of team, and then Puerto Rico was the last team at this tournament. And so both APNA and Chicago were both teams that would be considered regional teams. And so APNA represented in Canada, Chicago represented in Chicago. And so that's where we kick off this tournament. It was on May the 7th where we saw the Chicago team beat Greece by a score of 7-1, and Lebanon ended up beating Puerto Rico by a score of 6-5. This game, Chicago and Greece, not necessarily the closest of games we've seen at this tournament. A really tough game for Greece, and they were a slow starter at this tournament. Very similar to the men's side we just talked about. They did get better and better as this tournament did go along, but a tough start for them, losing 7-1 against Team Chicago. Then you go on to that second game for Lebanon and Puerto Rico, and this was a really fascinating game to watch, where you didn't see the same quality of kind of caliber of goaltending, the key saves where they could have been. For Puerto Rico, they struggled on their defensive side, and they outplayed Lebanon in this game. They controlled the pace for most of it. Unfortunately for them, the difference came is when Lebanon got the opportunity to score, they didn't miss. And that was also really a storyline throughout this entire tournament, is for a team like Lebanon, when you get the opportunities, you need to score on them. And they did a really good job in this game in particular at really doing so. And so for Lebanon, a very important win for them in the grand scheme of the standings, as well against a tough opponent in Puerto Rico, who had some bad luck throughout this tournament, and it continued for them into that next day of action against Greece, where Greece ends up pulling through with the 4-3 win over Puerto Rico. Lebanon and Chicago, we saw Lebanon take home a 4-3 win in overtime, which ended up handing Chicago's only loss at this series, at this tournament. And you think about these games, for Greece and Puerto Rico, a very tight checking game where, once again, it was a few key mistakes from the Puerto Rican team that ends up in the back of their net. They didn't get bailed out by the goaltending. That was a key difference, where a team like Greece, who did generate enough chances to win this game, they still ends up being a lot closer than what it probably should have been. At Lebanon, Chicago, a game that went to overtime, a very back and forth one as well. Chicago, I would say, was the better team, but Lebanon, a very pesky team that just kind of hung around, and when, once again, they got their opportunities, they did not miss on them. And so that was your second day of games on May the 8th. Then you went on to the May the 9th games, where we saw Greece take down Lebanon 3-0, and Chicago go and beat Puerto Rico by a score of 3-0 as well. The Greece-Lebanon game, I would say, wasn't all that kind of exciting as far as the gameplay went. It was a very tactical game and much more defensively minded game too, I may add, for both these teams. And it was really a setup for probably what was to come. Two of, I would say, the better teams, if not the best teams at this tournament, outside of maybe those regional teams. But you look at Greece, you look at Lebanon, they played a very strong game, both the teams did, and Greece just kind of found themselves on the victorious end of that one. Chicago and Puerto Rico was a very tight checking game too, where two teams that were trying to feel each other out, much more on the defensive side of things as well, I may add. Chicago ends up taking this one 3-0 to kind of secure their points at this tournament. They end up with 7 out of the possible 9 for them. Once again, they're a regional team, so they did not make the travel over to Canada, and so that's where their tournament ends up concluding on. But still, once again, a really strong tournament for that team, that regional team out of Chicago, which then brings us on to the more recent games, and that starts on July the 9th. This once again was held in Montreal, Quebec for leg number 2. We saw APNA, which was the team with Indian descent, take on Greece. Greece ended up winning that one 6-4 the final. It was a tight checking game from both those teams, not necessarily one team that I'd say played better than the other. But when the chances came, we saw the better players on Team Greece really take it to that next level. Then Lebanon and Puerto Rico. We saw Lebanon take down Puerto Rico in a very defensively minded game. Lebanon ends up being the better team just by way of pace, but it was a very tight checking, very defensively minded game that I wouldn't say either team was really kind of in the mood for. And this tournament was very offensive. It was just a kind of the storyline of the offensive tournaments. But ultimately, as the tournament continued onward, we saw those games and those score lines continue to get more and more stretched out. And so Lebanon ends up taking this one 4-2 the final, and it was a tight checking defensive game in that one. July the 10th we go, where Greece blows out Puerto Rico 12-1. APNA goes out and beats Lebanon 4-3 in a shootout. And you look at that game, the Greece-Puerto Rico one, not much to talk about there with the APNA and Lebanon game. Very, very tight throughout. And Lebanon, I would say yes. Obviously, as a kind of a full country team, you were expecting them to kind of be in that conversation, having the full games, all 6 games to play. You wanted and you were expecting them to see in that final round. And so with that in mind, I mean, Lebanon played a decent game here against APNA, but ultimately just kind of fell short in that shootout, a back and forth game throughout that ends up not going their way. But then we go on to the final day of round-robin action on July the 11th, where we saw APNA take down Puerto Rico, a 5-4 the final there, and then Greece went out and beat Lebanon by a score of 6-3. And you look at those games, APNA and Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican team had lots of chances in that game. They didn't capitalize on them. The APNA team was the better team throughout, but was definitely one of those games that much more of an offensive type of mindset. I thought the APNA team played very well and definitely earned their win every step of the way. But the important game, and the one that we'll focus in a little bit more on, is the Greece and Lebanon game, because as you can see just to the right of it, or if you're watching on YouTube, it was the most important game because that was going to be the final. And you look at the games that it's kind of the tone setter type of matchup, if you will, going into the final game for the championship, for the series, for the title. You want to build as much momentum as possible. And we talk a lot on this channel about momentum, building up momentum for the ones that matter. And for Greece, for Lebanon, Greece ends up pulling off the victory, which obviously builds up momentum in its own right. At the same time, Lebanon did a tremendous job here at building their own momentum and kind of taking those small victories where that's what you wanted to see them do, because it was very important they did so. They're a strong team. They were a strong team all tournament long. They were a pesky team. And then going into that final game, you were expecting them to be somewhat competitive, going kind of, you think about those standings, the final standings, we did see Greece in that top spot with 15 points, Lebanon with 9, Chicago with 7, APNA with 5, and then Puerto Rico with 0 points. Remember that both Chicago and APNA were both regional teams, so they only played 3 games at this tournament. And then we went on to that final game, and Greece and Lebanon for the gold medal, for the title, for the championship, for the World Women's Challenger Series title. We saw Greece completely dominate Lebanon in this one. And although the gameplay was relatively tight as far as the back and forth goes, we did see that refinement, the talent, the quality, the skill of Greece really come out in this game. And that was the difference, right? Is you just went up, if you're Lebanon, you just went up against a better team that had more skill, had more talent. And for Lebanon, they played very well. They had lots of chances throughout, but unfortunately for them, just couldn't really get that one big opportunity to put themselves, to change the momentum, to swing that game in their favor because of how well the Greeks played. And Greece ends up sweeping the Challenger Series. They take both the men's and the women's legs. And really, it was just an overall really well-ran tournament. And so it's great to see, right? And it's always great to see as these countries continue along. We're going to see kind of what ends up shaping out to be for them. They are going to likely start to try and make their way into the World Championship stage, starting at the lower divisions, especially as the IIHF continues to expand with their lower division tournaments. As far as some of those kind of key players, Zoe Ziotis from Greece, 7 games played, 9 goals, 5 assists for 14 points. Brittany Yamin for Lebanon had 5 games played, 5 goals, 3 assists for 8 points. Very strong campaign from her. And then for the Puerto Rican team, Sophie Zemianek, who's a defenseman, 5 games played, 5 goals, 2 assists for 7 points. We're kind of your key players of this tournament. I won't discuss too much on the regional teams, but for those overall kind of star players, the MVPs of the tournament for each of the respective countries, those are your key players to keep an eye out for. As these teams continue along and try and make their way into the IIHF, we'll see whether or not we'll be talking about these names over the coming years. As we will now shift along to topic number 5 today, and that will be Team Ukraine's international season recap. And for Team Ukraine, this international season has been relatively positive for them. You think about all their campaigns. They had a second place and a promotion finish at the Division 1A Men's World Championships. They had a 5th place finish at the World Juniors, and they had 2 bronze medals at both the Women's Worlds and the Men's Under-18 tournaments. And so it all started off for them, for Team Ukraine, at the Division 1A World Juniors, which was held from December 7th to 13th in Bled, Slovenia. They kicked off their campaign with a 2-1 win in overtime over Team Kazakhstan, a 3-2 win over Norway in overtime, or a 3-2 loss rather in overtime against Team Norway, a 4-3 loss against Team Slovenia, a 9-2 loss against Team Austria, and then a 3-2 win over Team France to close out their tournament. But this tournament for Team Ukraine was a really disappointing result after what was otherwise a very strong tournament. And you think about it coming in, their expectations, I would say, were right around kind of that 3rd or 4th spot overall. It wasn't exactly their best crop of players they've had, but still, you were expecting them to be fairly competitive. And you think about the teams, Kazakhstan, a very strong team at this tournament. Norway as well. Norway, obviously, the team who ends up earning that promotion bid. You were expecting them to be pretty good this year, but ultimately, for Team Ukraine, they had 2 very strong games off the top. We saw them play a very strong game against the Kazakhs, where they dominated Kazakhstan basically for 3 periods of play. The game against Norway was a very back-and-forth game, but Ukraine showed they were going to be competitive, and they were going to be able to keep scoring pace with a team like Norway. Then we went kind of through the rest of it, and this is where it went downhill. Their game against Slovenia was a game that they absolutely should have won. They kind of choke it away a little bit towards the end. Unfortunately for Ukraine, they don't get those right bounces, but for Slovenia, this was that kind of near-perfect game from them that they end up just annoying the Ukrainian team into making mistakes, and that's the difference, right? And sometimes that's all you need if you're Slovenia is a few mistakes one way or another, and you capitalize on them, and you end up taking this one. The Austrian game, for me, was a bit of a surprise just to see how bad it ended up getting. Austria, another really good team at this tournament, one of the teams who would be in that contention for that promotion bid, but once again, for Ukraine, it was a very disappointing end for them that they just kind of flunked their way out, and they find themselves in a position they don't want to be after losing some very important games. And you lose Slovenia, you lose to Austria, and then you go into your game against France, and all of a sudden it becomes so much more of an important game. yes, you end up winning against France, right? And it was a well-earned win. It was a competitive win. It was everything you wanted to see from this Ukrainian team. But at the same time, you have to question it a little bit. A kind of performance that, frankly, you look back on and wonder, well, what could it have been if it would have been a few different bounces here or there? And for Ukraine, yes, they end up finishing 5th at this World Junior Division 1A tournament. Is it the end of the world? No. Is it the best case scenario? No. So for Ukraine, all things considered, it wasn't the worst start that they could have had. It definitely wasn't the best start, but hey, you bring the eventual promoted team to overtime. You have some really good games against some of the better teams at this tournament. We'll see what ends up shaping out to be for Team Ukraine at this tournament, but not necessarily the best of starts for them to kind of kick off this campaign. Then we move on to the Division 2B Women's World Championship, which was held from March 30th to April the 5th in Hong Kong, China. We started this tournament with a 4-2 win for Team Ukraine over Mexico, an 8-2 win over Team New Zealand, a 5-1 win over Belgium, before they run into a little bit of that block. A 3-1 loss against Team Hong Kong, and then probably one of their most disappointing losses. Well, not really their most disappointing loss, but still a very dominant win, or a dominantly played game that ends up falling through their fingers against Lithuania, where they end up losing 3-2 in a shootout to them. But you think about the way this tournament kicked off, a game against Mexico that they really eked out the win in. You follow that one up with a dominant performance against New Zealand. And in that game against New Zealand too, I might just add, it was, yes, the scoreline was high, but even the pace of play generated a lot of momentum for them, trying to continue it forward. Their game against Belgium, very similar, where we saw them not only win on the scoreboard, but also in their play style. Their game against Hong Kong was a game that I would say they want back, and really both of these games were games that they're going to absolutely want back at the end of this tournament, because you think about this game against Ukraine, they outshot them 40-21. Hong Kong led 3-0 through the first 2 periods of play, and they just weren't able to get that kind of deciding goal, if you will. And that was kind of the storyline of this kind of tournament for them, for Team Ukraine, is yes, they had a lot of chances. Unfortunately, those chances just didn't really turn into much, and kind of followed through in their game against Lithuania. They outshot them 42-17 in this one, but unfortunately, just once again, the quality of chance, the ability to put the puck in the back of the net just wasn't there for this Ukrainian team, and that ends up being the deciding factor, and one of the reasons why for the Division 2B Women's Worlds, they end up falling short. So for Ukraine, a 3rd place finish here at the Division 2B Women's World Championships. We'll see what ends up shaping out to be for them as they continue their quest onward into next year. But they will absolutely be a favorite in this division, and we'll see kind of what ends up happening if they can earn their promotion spot. A lot of really big takeaways they'll have at this tournament. They played well throughout. They show that they are the team to beat. But now the question is whether or not they can kind of take what should happen and make it into an actually happening that will end up being a deciding factor for the Division 2B Women's World Championship. Ukraine did finish 3rd at this year's tournament. Then we move on to the Division 1A Men's Under-18 World Championships, which we saw in Krynica Zdrój, Poland, from April 18th to 24th. They end up finishing 3rd, taking home the bronze medal at this tournament. And you look at this tournament for Ukraine, and coming in, they weren't necessarily expected to be in the conversation for the promotion bid. You had teams like Switzerland, who was very strong as well. The Kazakhs were right up there as well, kind of those 2 teams that really led the charge at this year's Under-18 campaign. But they started off with a nice win over Team Slovenia. They followed up with a 6-4 loss against Hungary, a 5-3 loss against Kazakhstan, a 6-3 bounce-back win against Team Poland before they lost 6-5 in overtime against Team Switzerland. And so you look at this tournament for Team Ukraine, and part of the beauty of it is that the promotion bid for the men's under-18 tournaments were annulled because Belarus is coming into the top level or the top division for next year, and so any promotions end up getting annulled, and so we'll see what Switzerland, who ended up earning promotion at this year's men's under 18, at next year's men's under 18 division 1A tournament. And so what this means is that it's all about momentum now, and for Ukraine, a big win over Slovenia, nice win there. It was a competitive game that ends up going in Ukraine's favor. Their 6-4 loss against Hungary was one that they absolutely could have pulled off the win. Another tight game through and through. But in the end, Hungary, just that much better of a team, ends up pulling off with the victory there. And then their game against Kazakhstan was one that they're going to absolutely want back. You think about the way this game played out. It was a very strong start for Team Ukraine. They go up 3-0, and then Kazakhstan scores 5 unanswered goals. And unfortunately for Ukraine in this one, this was the turning point of their tournament. And they win this game. This is likely a very different discussion, because you go into that final day of game against Switzerland with the win. All you need to do is kind of pull off a win and you're in. It's a very different mindset for a team like Ukraine. And yes, they end up losing to Kazakhstan. From there, their tournament is more so how high can we get instead of can we earn that promotion bid. They beat Poland in, I would say, convincing fashion. They outplayed them through the entirety of that game. And then you go and look at the game against Switzerland, and it was a game that they can absolutely be happy walking away from, because for 60 minutes, 40 minutes, I would say, they were the better team. And you look at the way that Ukraine played all tournament long, it has the recipe for a team that could have earned promotion this year. And it's a bit of a surprise promotion too, because coming in, we weren't expecting, and we did it in our preview for this tournament. You can check that out on our YouTube page. We didn't expect that Ukraine would end up being in that promotion conversation. We knew they'd be close. We knew Kazakhstan and Switzerland were kind of your two leaders, and then Ukraine followed somewhere in between there. But they showed extremely well when you think about those games, right? A 5-3 loss for Ukraine in a game that they led 3-0 in, and then the 6-5 overtime loss against Switzerland, where, that game was so close right to the final whistle that it really could have went either way. And so for Ukraine, there's a lot of positives that they can take from this under-18 tournament and bring it into next year. And it's going to be very exciting to see kind of what they can do. If they can earn their bid, it's going to be a new crop of players, yes, as it is with just about every under-18 program. But keep an eye out, because Ukraine next year is going to be a team to watch at this Division 1A men's under-18 program that could very well put a scare into one of the most competitive men's under-18 Division 1A tournaments we may have ever seen in tournament history. So keep an eye out for next year. It's going to be a fascinating matchup. You think kind of the chaos that unfolded at the top division this past year, it's only going to get better. So for Ukraine, the men's under-18s was a very strong tournament for them. The result, a third-place finish, but a lot that they'll take into next year, and we'll see kind of what ends up shaping out to be as we head into their final tournament of the international season. This was the Division 1A Men's World Championship, which was held in Sosnowiec, Poland from May the 2nd to the 8th. They finished second at this tournament, which a reminder for the Men's World Championship, the top two places end up earning promotion. And so with that, it means that Ukraine also, on top of that, will earn promotion up to the top division. But this tournament started with a 3-2 loss to the hosts in Poland, and a very disappointing loss to kick off the tournament. We saw Ukraine bounce back in a big way, taking down Lithuania 2-1. They then went out and beat France 3-2. They ended up losing to Kazakhstan 5-4 in a shootout before taking down Japan 3-1 the final there. And as you look at this overall tournament for Team Ukraine, there was definitely quite a few positives. And yes, you start this tournament with a disappointing loss against Poland in a game that, frankly, you outplayed your opponent, and they got a few lucky bounces here and there, and it ended up deciding this game. Poland able to kind of take care of business. Yes, Ukraine gave away a few too many chances, but that's the kind of game that you expect, right? A dominant type of performance from Ukraine off the kick. They started decently well, although they do end up losing. They follow that up with a nice win over Lithuania, and whenever you go out and beat a team that's not as skilled as you, it's a good step in the right direction. And so for Lithuania, I thought that, or for this Ukrainian team against Lithuania, they played a really good bounce-back game. The kind of effort and results you wanted to see coming off of a loss. It was good to see them do that. Then you keep going. Their game against France, they pull off the win. Did they deserve the win? Probably not, but you get your chances, you bury your chances, and that's the key to success for the Ukrainian team this year, especially at this tournament, but also really throughout their tournaments. Then from there, a 5-4 loss in the shootout against Team Kazakhstan. This game, I would say more than anything else, was just Ukraine holding on for dear life. They end up snagging a point, which was a really big point in the grand scheme of things for them. And so the fact that you end up taking a team like Kazakhstan to the shootout was definitely a step in the right direction for them. And then you go to that final game against Japan, and they took care of business, although maybe a little bit more of a scare than what it should have been. Before Ukraine, they end up earning their promotion up to the top division for their first time since 2007, which is a huge deal for their program, and it's going to be exciting to watch to see what they can do at the top division next year. Once again, their first appearance at that top division since 2007. So for Team Ukraine for this international season, as far as their overall grade will go, we are going to give them a B+. You think about the way that they've played so far, there's been a lot of positives that they can draw. There's been some negatives, absolutely, and you think about that 5th place finish kind of being that main focal point of the negatives, but across their other 3 tournaments, one, they earned promotion, their first promotion up back to the top division since 2007, as well 2 third-place finishes in tournaments that they were pretty close in to being where they wanted to be, which is in that promotion spot. The men's under-18s alone was a major positive for me at this tournament, comparing it to expectations. And so for them, the B+ I feel is appropriate. I think especially when you consider that promotion, they do deserve a higher grade than kind of your standard B. But at the same time, a 5th place finish in the seconds ends up canceling out the bronze medal at the Women's Worlds. And then you also include that promotion bid. The 3rd places overall, just a really decent, good season for Team Ukraine. And we'll see what they can end up getting up to next year as we are going to get to see them at a top division event. So be sure to hit subscribe on our YouTube channel, where you will be able to see all of our full coverage for the Men's World Championship tournament for that. We might also do Division 1A this year. We'll see kind of how it ends up shaping out. So stay tuned. Lots of content well on its way. As we will now shift into our 6th topic of discussion today, and that will be one of the greatest storylines of every international season over the last few years, and that is Team Latvia. And for Team Latvia, yet again, it's another year of upsets. It's another year of destroying my brain as a Canadian fan and wondering what that next big upset is. And one of my favorite lines whenever we talk about Latvia is, it's not a matter of if they're going to pull off the upset, it's a matter of when. And we'll talk about all of their tournaments, and we'll start here with no one better than the World Junior Campaign. And we started here in Minnesota, USA from December 26th to January the 5th. And this game, the opening game of their tournament, was against Team Canada. A 2-1 win for Canada over Team Latvia. And you think about this game, Latvia ends up scoring that really late tying goal to force overtime. They then take a lousy penalty. Canada ends up winning that game in overtime. A very close game too, I may add, from pulling off that big upset. Then you end up getting blown out 8-0 against Team Finland. Latvia beats Denmark 6-3 to end up clinching their playoff bid for this tournament. Czechia beats them 4-2, and then in the playoff round, they get matched up with Sweden, where they end up losing 6-3 the final there. But for this tournament, you think about kind of the way that they end up playing it through. And for Latvia, they started with the bang. And yes, the game is a close game. Yes, Canada was probably the better team. But you think about the way that Latvia plays. What makes them so effective? It's the fact that they're not afraid to play a full defensive game and wait for a team like Canada to make their mistakes. And they played a masterclass at this tournament, and we're going to talk about the other tournaments as well. For Latvia, a tremendous game here against the Canadian team. Unfortunately for them, they don't end up getting that big win to throw off the standings like they did 1 year prior. But still, it does show well for them. In with an under-18 class, continuing to put forth impressive performances. Keep an eye out for this Latvian team at the upcoming World Juniors, which we'll talk about in a bit as well, because they're going to be a menace to keep an eye out for. Then we go to their other games. Their game against the Finns was just a battle of tactics, and unfortunately for a team like Latvia, when you have teams like the Finns who understand the way you play, they're going to be able to pick you apart. It was an 8-0 final. It was an ugly game for the Latvians, but for the Finns, a very well-played game there. Then their game against the Danes, where I'd say you look at the way that Latvia played, a dominant performance where, yes, I would say a lot closer than probably what they would have liked, but at the same time, a dominant effort. The Danes, you knew, had no chance in this one against Latvia, and a very strong performance there to end up sending them into that playoff round. And then their last game against the Czechs, and one that I would say was another game you were looking at as a potential upset type of game. Yes, the Czechs pull through with the victory and make it so that you don't get that one big upset at this World Junior Tournament, although forcing overtime against Canada, I guess you could definitely consider to be an upset there. But for the Czechs, a 4-2 win over Team Latvia. And then from there, we go to that playoff round in the quarterfinals. Sweden takes care of business against Latvia in dominant fashion. A 6-3 final there, and really just kind of took the wind out of the sails for the Latvians in the end of this one for the World Junior Top Division Tournament. Team Latvia will end up placing in 7th place, and although it wasn't exactly their best tournament they've played, still, I mean, you look at it, the big upset against Canada, forced overtime alone, was a really good step in the right direction. And then from there, they go on to the Women's Under-18s, which was held from January the 19th to 25th in Istanbul, Turkey. And they finished third at this tournament. They started it with a 3-2 shootout loss against Team South Korea, followed up with a 9-1 loss against Team Kazakhstan, and then we kind of saw them turn the curb a little bit, a 4-3 win over the Netherlands and a 4-0 win over Team New Zealand before losing to Turkey 4-1 to conclude their tournament here. And so you look at it for the Latvian team, there were some very strong games at this tournament. There were some very weak games at this tournament. Their first two games was more or less just playing against a team that was frankly better than they were. And sometimes it favors Latvia. We tend to see that at the top divisions, especially for teams that have a lot of expectations on them. I would say this Korea game was very similar to that expectation factor, where coming in, you were expecting South Korea to be amongst the favorites for this tournament. And this game here, I would say, kind of showed how they should be playing against a team like Latvia, controlling the pace of play through most of it, and Latvia just kind of being okay with that, playing strong defensive hockey and really allowing Korea to make the mistakes that end up in the back of their own net. That was a key to success for Latvia throughout all of their tournaments this international season, but especially here at the Women's Under-18s Division 2A tournament. We saw this one really start to become a focal point for them. From there, 9-1 loss, a blowout loss there. Weren't really able to kind of figure out that defensive structure. For Kazakhstan, they just played a very strong offensive game. Didn't give Latvia too much time to get themselves set up. A blowout type of finish there. Then 4-3 win for Latvia over the Netherlands, and what I would consider to be probably their most dominant game at this tournament. They played very strong in this one, especially against the Dutch, but for the Latvian team, it was another game that was probably a little closer than what they would have liked. They pull through with the victory, though, and I think that's most important for them in the end. That they get the big 3 points, they kind of protect themselves from that relegation spot, and so we'll see kind of what they can do heading into next year's tournament. Their game against New Zealand was another one that they were definitely very happy with, a dominant performance there as well over New Zealand, and they didn't give New Zealand much to work with. And then the last game against Turkey, where also playing the host, just couldn't really get that defensive structure fully implemented, weren't able to get those counterattack opportunities that they are so good at. That was a key difference maker there for the Latvians at that Division 2A Women's Under-18 tournament, in which they finished 3rd overall in. And so that was kind of that next tournament up. I wouldn't say it was their best tournament. Yes, they end up earning the bronze medal at that Women's Under-18s. But still, they get their job done. They kind of perform to expectations, I'd say. Entering that tournament, they were kind of 3rd, 4th overall. Entering it, they end up finishing in that 3rd spot. So overall, a pretty decent, to expectations, good, not great, not terrible, but good enough type of performance for the Latvians. Then we go on to the big one for Latvia, and this was the Olympics. And for Latvia, we talked quite extensively coming in about how there was the potential for them to pull off the upset of the upset of the upset. Did it happen? Not really. And you kind of think about how this tournament started for them. A 5-1 loss at the hands of Team USA. They followed it up with, I guess you could call it the upset win of the tournament against Team Germany, in which they beat them 4-3. They then lost to Denmark 4-2, and we won't go too much further into the one goal that ended up killing them. But long story short, they pulled their goaltender. They didn't pull their goaltender. They wouldn't have to play the impossible team in Sweden, who we'll talk about in a bit. They end up basically pulling their goaltender. They get scored on with the empty net. It sets up their qualification round matchup against Team Sweden, which is not an easy team to go out and beat. Sweden pummels them 5-1. And what was a pretty ugly game overall for the Latvians, a disappointing end of this tournament. You think about what it could have been for them with the path that they could have had. They end up falling just a little bit short there. But still, for Team Latvia, this Olympic tournament wasn't exactly their best tournament they've played. Yes, they get the upset over Germany, but they're pulling the goalie. The one goal ends up coming back to bite them in the end. They finish in 10th place overall out of 12 teams at the Olympic Games, and so a disappointing return to NHL players playing at this tournament for them. But it did not dull their spirit, and we continue onwards here with the Division 1B Women's World Championship, which was another one that kind of coming off that Olympic campaign, we saw a little bit of that drag for the Latvian program, where this tournament, I wouldn't say was their best tournament that they've played. And their game against Kazakhstan, they kicked off the tournament with a 3-2 win in the shootout over Team Kazakhstan. They then lost 7-6 against Team Korea, South Korea. They then beat Team Great Britain 4-3 in overtime before losing to Spain 3-0 and the Netherlands losing to them as well 6-3. And so for Team Latvia at this tournament, it was one that it was a 5th place finish, kind of ending it. But really, you look at the way they played, and there were quite a few games in here that Latvia just kind of allowed these other teams to stick around. And there's 2 games in particular that I think draw a lot of attention to that fact. The first one is their one against Kazakhstan, in which they should have been a much more dominant team in it. They let the Kazakhs stick around far too long, didn't really get that goal to separate them in this game. And the other one, and probably the bigger one and more important one, was their game against Team Great Britain, where they just kind of sat back a little bit too long, and they allowed the game to go to overtime. They bled another point. And if you are going to be a promotion team, which we thought Latvia could be at this Women's World Championship tournament, kind of getting themselves up to that Division 1A level, we didn't see that be the case. They didn't play that kind of strong, defensively minded game. And even their game against South Korea, where the game got opened up quite a bit more, we didn't really see that strong defensive presence like we're so accustomed to seeing from the Latvian program. And so for a team like Latvia, yes, right? You end up surviving, and so that alone is a good sign of things to come. But still, you're looking at the Latvian team and wondering, well, what could it have been, right? Could you have potentially earned your way up at the tournaments? For Latvia, a disappointing end to this tournament for them. A fifth-place finish after losing their last two games against both Spain and the Netherlands in somewhat ugly fashion, even though Spain was the team who ended up being sent down. And so we'll see kind of what ends up shaping out to be for them. But at the same time, it is definitely a tournament that they will look back on and kind of wonder what it could have been for them here. But for Team Latvia, the Women's World Championship Division 1B ended in that fifth-place finish, which then kind of sets up the one that I'm sure a lot of our Latvian friends are coming to check in on, and that is the top division men's under-18 tournament, in which we also had full coverage here on the channel, and I believe also on the podcast. For this one, it happened from April 22nd to May the 2nd in Trenčín and Bratislava, Slovakia. And this one, it started quite ugly for Team Latvia. A 6-0 loss at the hands of Team Canada and a 2-0 loss at the hands of Team Finland before they bounced back in a pretty big way, taking down Norway by a score of 8-1. We then saw Slovakia take care of business against Latvia in the final game of the round robin, defeating them 5-2, before the playoff rounds kicked around and we were looking at this Latvian team and wondering, when is that upset going to come? And sure enough, they line up against Team USA, a US team that wasn't exactly the best of teams they've sent in years past. We felt that this could be the upset we were all anticipating, and sure enough, it was. 5-2 the final for Team Latvia, taking down Team USA in upset fashion at the men's under-18 World Championship. It was a dominant game played by the U.S., but where it counted, the U.S. made a few too many mistakes. The Latvians countered back up ice, and they ended up scoring, taking that game by a final score of 5-2. Then set up the semifinals in a game that they absolutely could have won, en route to either a gold or a silver medal for Team Latvia. Unfortunately, they fall out just short, losing to Team Slovakia 1-0. The hosts get sent on to the gold medal game. Latvia ends up playing for bronze against Team Czechia. And unfortunately for Latvia, they are unable to pull off the upset against the Czechs, and they end up losing 4-1 in the bronze medal game, placing them in that fourth spot overall. But you look at the tournament for Team Latvia, there was so many positives to take away from it. As well, too, I might add that the men's under-18 program tends to be a feeder for the World Junior program, and so don't be surprised to see that start to become a factor to keep an eye on over the next few years, because Latvia is putting together quite the squad on the World Junior stage and could very well pull off that huge upset. I'm so excited to see what ends up shaping out to be for Latvia. But you look at this tournament, a tough start, right? You're going to have to go through Canada and Finland, two very dominated losses there. Then the game against Norway was a really good bounce-back game for the Latvians. I don't think anyone was expecting it to be that bad. We thought Latvia would be able to pull off the win, but Norway, with the extent that they did play at this tournament, we thought that, for Latvia, just a tremendous game that really took a lot of us off guard. Then Slovakia just went out and beat Latvia, not too much more there. Latvia with just clawing on, holding on for dear life, of some tremendous goaltending in net, and ends up beating the U.S. 5-2, falling just short of the Slovaks. They came close, could have been a goaltender challenge. There was a lot that happened in that game that very well could have shifted the tide. Unfortunately for Latvia, just could not pull off the win. And then the Czechs, 4-1 win over Latvia in that final game there. And that was the difference, right? And for Latvia, oh so close to coming back in the medals. They do just narrowly miss out here at the men's under-18s. But then it did not stop there for Team Latvia, as they shifted along to the top division at the Men's World Championships, in which they started this tournament from May 15th to 31st in Zurich and Freiburg, Switzerland, with a 4-2 loss against the host in Switzerland, followed it up with a 2-0 win against Team Germany, then lost to Austria 3-1, lost to Finland 7-1, before bouncing back, beating the USA 4-2, beat Great Britain 6-0, and then Hungary 8-1, before losing to Norway in the quarterfinals of the tournament by a score of 2-0. And you look at this tournament, the Men's World Championship top division tournament, it was a really fun ride to watch because there were kind of so many weird games that ended up playing out. We guessed accurately kind of that first week of games, and then it just went absolute chaos mode. For the Latvian team, their win against Germany should have been what ended up setting them into that quarterfinal round, right? They lost to the Swiss, which was expected. They then go out and beat the Germans, which should put them into the quarterfinal round as long as they don't lose to Austria. They then lose to Austria. And so now you're looking at, okay, which games can they win to get themselves back into contention? You're probably not beating the Finns. The Finns understand the systems. It's a very tough game whenever you go and play Finland. The game against the U.S. for me was a fascinating game because it was their best chance to dig themselves out. And sure enough, they do. They win 4-2 there. They take care of business against Great Britain and Hungary. And then from there, the opportunity presents itself. The team that you want to play, if you're Latvia, to guarantee yourself a chance to play for a medal would be Norway. And yes, Norway ends up going on to win the bronze medal. That was, and that could have been the Latvian team in a pretty big way. And unfortunately for them, they just fall out that little bit short. And it could have been a very different tournament in the end. But Norway, your eventual quarterfinal winners here over Latvia, they end up, of course, going on to win that bronze medal in what was a pretty entertaining tournament for the Norwegian team. Quite a few upsets there for Slovenia as well. We saw quite a few upsets on the other side of the bracket, who we actually did just recap on the podcast. I think it was either last week or the week before. So if you haven't already, be sure to go check that out. But for Latvia this year, as far as their final grade, I am going to give them a solid B. I don't think that there's much justification for them to go higher than that. But also they have a pretty solid base. They weren't relegated at any tournaments. And you really look at it across the board, right? A 10th place finish at the Olympics was a negative for them. They thought they could, and I personally thought they should have and could have got a lot higher, especially after their win over Team Germany. They should have went on and beat Denmark as well, really boost them at that tournament. And so the losing by that goal, the single goal that ends up coming back to bite them, for me was a big reason why I have them lower on my rankings as far as that final grade goes. The 5th place finish at the Women's Worlds for me was a disappointing one. The World Junior finish outside of their game against Canada wasn't their best tournament they've played at the World Juniors, and so for me that was another one that I'd say they were a little bit lower than probably what they could have been. The Women's Under-18s, I thought that they played okay in. I thought they definitely kind of performed to expectations. Not terrible, but also not great. The men's under-18s, I thought, was probably their best tournament all year, the 4th place finish. And it was a really well-played tournament from them. And I think that is the kind of tournament you look back on, that when they roll around to the World Junior campaign in a year or 2 years, they're going to look back and they're going to draw a lot of those players who have been there, who have done that have that experience now at play at the top level against some of the better teams in the world. And that's going to be a team you're going to keep an eye on, because Latvia is always a dangerous team at these tournaments, and it's only going to get more competitive for them. So keep an eye out for Latvia at the men's under-18s, a very strong point of their international campaign. And then their men's world championship, where it was just a masterclass of upsets. Their win over Germany, their win over Team USA, and then really just taking care of business across the board. They played a well-played game against Norway, just couldn't really get that goal that ends up shifting the tide in that game. And so for Latvia, it was overall a good season. It wasn't necessarily the blow-it-away season. They had their blow-it-away tournaments. I'm not going to say they didn't. But there wasn't really across the board kind of that kind of reason to put them much higher. There wasn't the medal that puts them into that conversation. There's not the relegation either. So once again, they are kind of in that medium kind of range. And so for me, their final grade for this international season will be a B. They had a very good season overall. It's a lot of surprises, a lot of upsets, and it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see what's going to come for Team Latvia as they look ahead to next year and try and pull off the upset of all upsets and maybe, just maybe, take home a gold medal along the way. As we will now head into our last segment of today, and that will be the World Junior Summer Showcase, which is coming very soon. And as of the point of recording this podcast, it is July 22nd. Very likely this podcast will be uploaded to the audio platforms on July 23rd. And so what that means is that on July 26th, we will begin our campaign for the World Junior Summer Showcase, where you can find our full recaps of the days on our YouTube platform as well. We will likely also upload the audio versions to our respective streaming platforms. And so what you can expect for this tournament is it's basically the precursor to the World Juniors. And think of it more like a tryout. The World Junior Summer Showcase is a way for the top 4 countries, which, I mean, you can debate who the top 4 countries are, but basically Canada, Sweden, Finland, and the US play in what's called the World Junior Summer Showcase, which is happening this year in Windsor, Ontario from July 26th to August the 1st. And this tournament is really just a way to get some eyes on players for the potential run at the World Juniors. And it's a great tournament to watch because you get to see what's to come. It's going to be a really entertaining year as well. I will also mention that the Hokej Cup is coming around the corner. We'll also have full coverage for that. So stay tuned. There are 8 teams participating in that one. We are hoping to get all 8 team previews out at some point, so stay tuned there. We'll have a lot of coverage for that tournament, and so stay tuned. Lots of content coming for both the World Junior Summer Showcase and the Hokej Cup. But we will kind of talk a little bit more about what this tournament is for the World Junior Summer Showcase, how it works. And how it works is basically the top 4 teams come in. The U.S. as well, it's important to mention, will come in with 2 teams. And so they will come in with their white team and their blue team. And so those teams will end up merging after kind of their exhibition games go. The white and blue team will play against Finland and the Swedes. They'll kind of flip-flop there. And then from there, they'll play there with their actual team through the rest of the tournament here. And so what that means is we'll kickstart our games on July the 26th at 12 o'clock noon Eastern time. That will be 6 o'clock p.m. Central European, 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern European time, where USA White will play against Team Finland, and USA Blue will take on Sweden at 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern. That will be 10 o'clock p.m. Central European time, and will be the opening game or the opening day of this tournament. These games are technically exhibition games because, once again, the USA has 2 teams that they are bringing over initially before they do end up merging their teams together, taking their best players. It will eventually be a preview for what's to come at the World Junior Tournament. July 27th, we will see the USA Blue team taking on Finland and the USA White team taking on the Swedes. USA Blue takes on Finland at 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. That will be 9 o'clock p.m. Central European time and 10 o'clock Eastern European time. Then the 7 o'clock slot will be at 1 a.m. Central European time and 2 a.m. Eastern European time. So for our European friends, it is going to be a little bit of a later night for you all, but hopefully you will be joining us for our coverage in the morning once you do eventually wake up, because we will have full coverage for this tournament once again. But from there, then you go on to the actual tournament. And they'll practice on the 28th, so you have a day off there of rest. But then July 29th, you will see Finland taking on the USA. Once again, that is the USA merged team, which means that it's the best players from both the white and the blue team will end up coming together to represent Team USA on this international stage. That game will be at 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern. It'll be 10 o'clock p.m. Eastern European time. And then Canada, the host of this tournament, will take on Sweden at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. That will be at 1 o'clock a.m. Central European time. From there, they then will go on to July 30th. Sweden will take on Unified Team USA at 3 o'clock p.m. And Finland will take on Team Canada at 7 o'clock p.m. August the 1st, we will see Sweden taking on the Finns at 12 o'clock p.m., which will be noon Eastern time, 6 o'clock p.m. Central European, and 7 o'clock Eastern European time for the battle of one of the best rivalries in all of sports, Sweden and Finland, and then USA and Canada to close out the tournament at 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern. That'll be at 10 o'clock p.m. Central European time. And so it's going to be a really fun tournament to watch. You have 4 teams who have quite storied World Junior kind of histories. Think about the U.S. They were back-to-back gold medalists not so long ago. You have Sweden, who's coming off the gold medal. Finland, who just won silver, not last year, but the year before. And then Canada, who hasn't been good in a while, but they just won bronze this past year and are looking to try and earn their way back onto the international stage. They got skunked this year at the IIHF tournaments. They walked away with no gold medals. They are hoping to change that in the opening tournament, or as well the Women's World Championship coming up. But from there, they're also hoping at the World Juniors to try and earn their way back, because the Women's World's not looking great for Team Canada, especially after what happened at the Olympics and the Women's Worlds last year. It's not a great landscape for Team Canada, and so we'll see kind of what ends up shaping out to be. But as far as some of those kind of key players who you should keep your eyes out for this World Junior Summer Showcase tournament, because most importantly is that this tournament represents an opportunity to scout the players who will end up being on the World Junior campaign or World Junior roster. And so that is more importantly what we're going to be focusing on throughout this tournament. Is less about kind of what the actual results are. Where typically we focus a lot more on the results. This tournament is more about kind of taking a look at, well, which players are going to be representing the teams that when the tournament actually starts to count will end up being on that roster. And so for the World Juniors, there are a few players from each team that I would say I have my eyes set on. We'll start here with Team Sweden, who was kind of their first team to release their roster. The first guy, and probably one of the guys who, if you follow international hockey long enough, you might remember from the U18s, not last year, but the year before in 2025, who was Filip Ekberg. And for Filip Ekberg, he had 18 points in 7 games. And then from there, he had a really poor fall-off performance through the rest of his season. Ends up getting drafted 221st to Carolina, a late flyer type of pick for the Carolina Hurricanes in the NHL. He's a guy who I'm looking at to have a breakout type of tournament here, because you look at international hockey in general, it brings out the best. And for a guy like Ekberg, this is his opportunity to earn his way back in to that starting type of lineup. And I think this World Junior Summer Showcase is his opportunity to show that what ends up happening in league play doesn't necessarily transfer over. And so for a guy like Ekberg, it's a really big opportunity for him here at this Summer Showcase to show what he can actually do. And I'm really excited to watch his game as it continues on. And along the lines of our U18 coverage, most recently we'll talk about Elton Hermansson, recently 19th overall pick to the LA Kings in this most recent NHL draft. You look at him, 12.7 games played at those U18s. And also, before I forget to mention, Ekberg was also the MVP of the tournament back in 2025. But for Hermansson, another kind of offensively minded player, a gifted player, and we'll see what he can end up doing at this tournament, because he's another guy you're looking at to really continue to show why he is one of the better players in this draft class. There's a reason why he went first round in the NHL draft. There's a reason why he was one of the better players at the Under-18 Men's World Championship this past year, which we just talked about with Team Latvia. We're going to get to see for Team Sweden what is going to end up being this final roster. And I think Hermansson has a very good opportunity here to show why he deserves to be on this roster. And another guy who I have my eyes set on, I want to call him a lock for this Swedish team as far as their defensive corps go, is Malte Gustafsson, who had a tremendous under 18 campaign, 5.6 games played. It was a +7 as well. A very strong skater, a very strong defensively minded player as well, who can generate a little bit on the offensive side as well. The number 13th overall pick to the New York Islanders at this most recent NHL draft. He's a guy you should definitely keep your eyes out for at this tournament, as he once again tries to earn his own stock heading into that World Junior campaign. This is a guy who you are going to notice very quickly out there. He's a very solid player all overall, and so keep an eye out for a guy like Malte Gustafsson, who will be one of those players you do want to keep an eye out for at this tournament. The next team we'll talk about is Team USA, and I think there's no one better to start with, kind of along the lines of our U18 coverage, than Wyatt Cullen. And for a guy like Wyatt Cullen, you look at kind of his development, and for Cullen, he was a smaller guy who very quickly grew. He basically grew nearly a foot over the course of the last year and a half, kind of went from being a scratch-off NHL draft pick to being kind of a top 10 pick. He ends up being pick number 10 to the Nashville Predators. For a guy like Wyatt Cullen, 9 points in 5 games played at the most recent men's under 18 World Championships. He's a very quality, solid, offensively minded player who can contribute as well on the defensive side. Probably going to be one of the most important pieces for the U.S. roster as they shift into World Junior season. He's a guy who you will absolutely notice out there on the ice. He will be an offensive machine when he gets the opportunity to do it. Keep an eye out for a guy like a Wyatt Cullen at this summer showcase tournament. He will light the lamp. He will also contribute a lot on that assist side as well. This is the kind of guy who I would say you do want to definitely keep your eye out for, because he is going to be the future, really, kind of a face of a program, I'd say, over the next few years. Kind of think of a guy like a James Hagens as well, who's become kind of that face of the program for the World Juniors during their runs of success. I would say, and Ryan Leonard as well is another guy who you've seen kind of be that success marker. Don't be surprised to see a guy like Wyatt Cullen kind of be that leader for this U18 program, a guy who I will say I'm very excited to watch at the summer showcase, see if he can earn a spot onto that World Junior roster. The next guy to talk about will be Chase Reed, who will be returning and basically is a lock to be on this World Junior roster. I thought he played okay at last year's World Junior tournament. We saw him in all 5 games played. He had 4 points and really logged a lot of minutes. He was 20 minutes, just over 20 minutes a game on average for that tournament. And you think about the responsibility he had and the responsibility he's going to continue to have coming into this tournament, because he's going to be that go-to guy for his country at this World Junior campaign. I'm super excited to see kind of what ends up shaping out to be for a guy like Chase Reed, the number 7th overall pick. He fell quite a bit in that NHL draft to the Seattle Kraken, and so we'll see if he can show why he should have gone a little bit earlier in the draft at this summer showcase, but as well as he continues on through the World Junior tournament. Then we go to probably one of the most interesting names that we will see at this tournament, and that will be Sammy Nelson, who is a 2027 draft eligible player. He's a kind of a later born 08, so what that means is that he will be kind of in the 07, so will be in that next draft class basically. And so what that will mean and what gets very, very exciting here is for Sammy Nelson, he is going to be a top 5 projected pick, likely will fall inside that top 5 into next year's draft, and he has the opportunity here to earn a lot of draft stock. Kind of think over the last few years, Chase Reed was one of those guys who earned his draft stock at the World Juniors. You can think of a guy like even like a Gavin McKenna, a guy like Ivar Stenberg, Viggo Bjork, who's trying to earn that draft stock. A guy here like a Sammy Nelson is that type of player, and he's going to be a legit threat, right? He's going to be a legit player who's going to be an offensive machine. He's going to be the kind of guy you're going to look to here to really help this U.S. team on the World Junior stage. And I'm really excited to see what he can end up doing because he's going to be a very important part to this roster. And we'll see what it ends up shaping out to be. He's going to be kind of a very relied upon player for this U.S. team, but it will definitely be interesting to see here what ends up happening for Sammy Nelson. If he can make that kind of consolidated team, he will put himself in a very good spot to end up making that U.S. roster come December 26th. So definitely a player to keep your eyes on, Sammy Nelson for the U.S. And then we go to the Finns, who just recently announced their roster. That was as of today. We are still waiting on Canada's roster as of the time of filming this. However, very likely that will end up coming out probably by the time the exhibition games start. I would assume it'll be by Saturday, which will be the 26th, I believe, or Sunday, which will be the 26th. So it likely, just by the timing of this podcast, we don't have Canada's quite yet, but keep an eye out for it, because once it comes out, we will also put in the comments of our post-production videos, which is probably also where you're watching this segment on, where you will be able to see who our go-to players will be for Team Canada this year. Before the Finns, there are a few players who you should definitely keep an eye out for. The first is Samu Alalari, who is a defenseman. We've seen him at quite a few tournaments. We saw him at the U18s as well as the Hokej Gretzky. He was the 66th overall pick in 2026, this most recent draft to the Chicago Blackhawks. He's had great tournaments at the U18s and the Hokej Gretzky, both of those tournaments, 5 games played in each of them for 4 points. And as a defender, he's relied upon heavily, and a strong defensively minded player who can contribute off the rush. He's a strong skater. He's a physical guy. And for the Finns, he's going to become probably one of the most important pieces to the Finnish defensive core that they're going to have coming into this World Junior campaign. I'm excited to see what he can do at the summer showcase, to see kind of where the Finns sit overall, because every year that the Finns come in to these World Junior tournaments, you never really know where they're going to end up kind of fitting in, because there is such a wide range of players that you don't really know how their team composition is going to mend, how the chemistry factor is going to improve, because especially for a team as well structured as the Finns are, you need to see them play within that type of structure. Otherwise, they start to struggle, especially against some of the better teams like the U.S., like Canada, like the Swedes, the Czechs. You can continue to go down that list. But that's kind of a key player for this Finnish team that you're going to look to kind of keep an eye out for. Another one to keep an eye on here is the goaltender, Patrick Kirkala, who will likely be that starter. We saw him at the 2025 under-18s. He had 2.44 goals against, 8.86 save percentage. He will also be returning to this squad. I would say that, yes, Juuso Enesto also going to be on this roster for the Finns. He was a drafted guy this past year. I don't think he will end up starting for this team. I think Kirkala will be that go-to goaltender come December 26th. Although, once again, part of the beauty of it is you don't really know. And I think for the Finns in the end here, it's going to just come down to which goaltender gets hot at the right time. If we'll see kind of as this tournament progresses, if any goaltender kind of stands out. But in the end, I think Kirkala is going to be that go-to goaltender for the Finns, and one to definitely keep an eye on through this summer showcase to see if he can earn that starter spot for the tournament coming in December. But for the World Juniors this year, we've talked about it pretty extensively throughout these podcasts in the offseason as well. We even talked about it a little bit at the end of last year as well, even at the end of the U18s, that this tournament coming up is going to be one of the most competitive World Junior tournaments we have ever seen. You're going to have teams like Latvia. You're going to have teams even like in Norway, who's coming up, the promoted team. You're going to have a variety of different teams who are legit threats this year. we are going to get to see some great hockey. Latvia is going to be an annoying team who's going to cause some problems. You have Finland, Sweden, Canada, the U.S., who are always kind of those favorites to win. You have the Czechs, who are going to be a difficult team to go out and beat. The Swiss are always a tough team. There are so many teams at this World Junior Tournament this year that could very well pull off that big upset and find themselves into that gold medal game. And so for the World Juniors, I could not be more excited. The Summer Showcase is that start of what's to come. But in the end here, keep an eye out for it. The World Juniors quickly approaching as we do make our way into the later stages of our off-season coverage. It's July 23rd or July 22nd, I guess. And from here, as we continue to tick down on the international season, the Women's World Championships coming up in November, and then very quickly approaching will be that World Junior Tournament. Stay tuned for lots of coverage on all of it. We'll be covering this World Junior Summer Showcase Tournament. That will be your preview for this one, and be sure to stay tuned for our day recaps, and we'll talk which players have impressed, which players will not be on the roster, and which players might just stand a shot. And so that will do it today for our scheduled content. We will now shift over to viewer questions. If you do have any questions, be sure to leave them in our chat below, and we will discuss them here on the channel. But I do appreciate everyone for tuning in today. Make sure to smash the like button and hit subscribe if you are watching with us live here on YouTube. We have a question here from Nick, the IIHF fan, who says, with the Women's Worlds now in November and thus the rankings likely not coming out until late November or December, do you think it'll still be 2028 that gets taken into account for Women's Olympic qualifiers, or should it get shifted to 2027? That's actually a good question. I would assume it's still the 2028 rankings, although I realize that it's probably a lot more difficult to be able to properly adjust for that. So I would say they'll have it figured out, but it could also be that the Women's World Championship 27 counts for double points, or 2026 counts for double points because it is later. And so we'll see kind of how it ends up shaping out, but I'm sure they have a contingency plan well far and established, because they do know what they're doing, even if sometimes it doesn't appear so. But still, for the IIHF, I do think that that's what they'll end up doing, is just keeping it with the 2027, just because it will be a little more difficult for them to get to that 2028 stage. And so we'll see for sure what they end up deciding to do. But that will end up doing it today for episode number 12 of the On the Fly International Hockey Podcast, in partnership with the Cyclone Sports Podcast Network. A huge thank you to everyone who hung out with us in the live chat today, and for those listening over on the audio version of the program. If you've enjoyed our breakdown of the state of international hockey, make sure you've hit that subscribe button on YouTube and turned on notifications so you never miss a live stream. For our listeners on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow and a 5-star rating, which helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. Don't forget to follow us at OnTheFly1515 on Instagram, X, and TikTok for highlights and news throughout the week. I am your host, Parker McLean, and until next time, see ya.